welcome to the show.
Hi, how you doing, Joe?
I'm doing amazing. So when I was thinking about your career and I was prepping for this, Suzanne, I was thinking, okay, so you've done psychoanalytical work, you've got 25 years of clinical practice, you've got dealing with couples in relationship, sex therapy. To me, that seems like, one of the most meaningful and fun careers someone could have.
It is. I highly recommend it.
So
Never
how
a
do
dull moment.
never a dull moment. So when you look back on, say, the last 25 years, how do you reflect on, your career?
Oh, it's kind of hard to believe it's that long. We'd like to think that time goes so fast. I think when you are loving what you're doing, time goes so fast. So it's almost so humbling to realize how many years I've been at this. But it's there's some ways that things have changed so much, Joe, over all those years, because I'm old enough to have gone through some major things that affect relationships and sexuality. Probably one of the most impactful was, let's say, the HIV and AIDS crisis of the 80s. And issues with open marriage, the first open marriage wave. There's a second one now. So there are many, and feminism, and all of the changes that have happened. And then there's some just universals that it doesn't matter how many decades you live through, how many cultural changes there are, that still there are just some basics that never change over time. So it's an interesting combination of seeing so many really sea changes, or let's say even marriage equality passing in so many countries, for LGBT people. So there are these major changes, and then there are just some things that are always the same.
What are some of the foundational truths? Because you and I both know Shane Parrish. Shane
Yes,
has this,
yes,
I would
he's
describe
great.
a sort of a real fetish for timeless wisdom, which I
Yes,
which
that's
I love.
true.
So, what would be some timeless principles for relationships?
Oh, well, probably one of the biggest ones, I think, are how to deal with differences. I think that is a major one. And sometimes some couples might, when a couple comes into me, Joe, and says, "Oh, we don't have any secrets. We don't have any differences. We agree on everything. We know everything about each other. We tell each other everything." I get a little bit nervous thinking, how could that be? These are two individuals who have different relational and family and sexual histories. And how could it be that that's similar? Is it that there's some way they're co-creating this kind of belief that they are carbon copies and therefore everything's so harmonious? And there are even many couple therapists who would be a little bit curious about people never having anger toward each other, never feeling disappointment, never really feeling that they are at odds with each other. So I think that for those couples who might present almost as twins, there could be what we call emerging or a lack of differentiation, meaning they really can't tolerate the whole idea of being with someone who could be different in any particular way. It's too threatening, and they happen to find a partner who at that same level of cannot tolerate that differentiation or the differences. But most people, when they say, let's say, communication is a major theme, usually what that means is that partly what it could mean is my partner's too different from me. I can't persuade them to be like me or to agree with me. So therefore, we have a communication problem. And actually, it might not be a communication problem. It could be you can't tolerate that your partner might really feel differently about XYZ. So I think differences is probably it. And I often help couples reframe or re-narrate that differences don't mean lack of compatibility. Differences don't mean I should trade this one in for a different model, who's more like me. It could mean more, how could I begin to tolerate the difference, and we talk about it and be curious about it within each other, not judge it. See, is there a win-win? We're not going to be carbon copies, but almost like two Venn diagrams with the two circles. Can we find how much the two circles overlap enough that we can be happy enough? This whole idea of good enough is a very important concept in couple therapy.
Yeah, I love that idea of thinking win-win type thing. It's almost like Stephen Covey in the 7 Habits, right?
That's right.
So one of the things in which I would love to discuss with you is when I put out this post, there seemed to be a real appetite amongst our audience, the most comments we've ever had on a post, which is just incredible by some number as well. So it seems to me like the general feeling is that there is, we seem to be heading towards what I felt like a nihilistic view of relationships. People seem to be sort of losing faith,
Mm.
and I would even put myself in this, and I'm the guy that I grew up, and I was the guy that I love to love, right?
Oh,
I'm a connector, even in a situation like, say, like a one night stand or a hookup. I mean, I'll ask them questions. I want to stay with them the next day, all these
oh,
things.
yeah.
But I mean, even myself, in this time where it seems like relationships seem to be more transient than ever, right? It's like, what sort of case would you make? Maybe perhaps it's not a reproductory one for relationships.
Well, one of the things I think has really changed relationships, and I'm old enough to say this, is I remember dating in the old days when you didn't have a phone, you didn't hook up on an app, you didn't check someone's, even the personal ads, you didn't even have really that many kinds of personal ads. Or if they were in just a small little place of one particular magazine or one particular newspaper they actually read that was paper. So there were no screens then. And all the technology of connection now, but I would say it's connection with a small c, Joe, because it's so it can sound so transactional. So many of my patients come in and they're preparing, things to put on Tinder or Grinder or any of the dating apps, and it's like they're marketing themselves, almost like an object, and I lived through the feminist movement in the United States, where we battled for years against objectifying women, but we wouldn't want anyone to be objectified either. We don't want men to be objectified either, or children, right? And many ways now, it's everything's so fast with technology, and judgments then are made so quickly, um, that the damage, we call it in analytic terms, there's so many opportunities for narcissistic wounds. I mean, it means there's so many times when you could be hurt in one day. You just look and you see how many swipes did I get, right, or not, or how many likes, or whatever the whole thing is. I don't even know all of the technology because I intentionally don't engage in it. I think I really think it makes for a real mental health problem, even with teenagers. I mean, look at the teenage suicides that can come from social media shaming, the ways the kids put out things about girls and boys online and how much it's affected them and damages them. So there's way too much public but non-accountable relationships that kids are starting to experience from a very young age. And then when you move into dating times, it just transfers right over to dating. And it makes people, I think, feel easily dismissed. And like someone like you, actually, Joe, who wants to attach, even if it's with a one night stand or even someone who would be like a dating, girlfriend or something, but that you want to attach. And the attachment challenges of now the social media and the way people date, I think, is a real challenge.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, from what you were talking about in terms of how things have changed, I suppose if you went back maybe 30 years ago, you would see someone at the bar and you'd have to hype yourself up to go and approach them.
That's
And then
right.
you'd ask them out, and then you'd go out and have a great date, and you'd be thinking about them all week.
That's right.
And now I suppose you meet someone on an app, you don't even have to leave the comfort of your own room.
That's right.
You go out with them, and you may even have a good date, but by the time you've got home, you've got maybe 4 or 5 more matches.
That's right.
So I suppose in modern times, I mean, I've seen movements like MGTOW, men going their own way. They're just saying, I've just got no interest, I just don't want to even try to contend with it. So I wonder, after everything in which you've seen in terms of, you must have seen. I wouldn't even like to guess the, everything which you've seen. Do you still hold or maybe do you hold uh, a sense? Do you still hold a sense of optimism and romance about relationships, or do you have a different view?
No, I definitely do. And, you
Amazing.
can turn to neuroscience even, and we do believe in science still here in the United States, despite what some of the narratives are coming out of our country. But, if you look at neuroscience and the neuroscience of love, like Helen Fisher's work, who I love, and she really conducts the studies of neuroscience and love and attachment and sexual attraction. And like after all, Joe, we're still just human beings. We're animals. We're part of the animal kingdom, and we are still wired in certain ways. And when you look at the early psychology studies, I don't know if you learned this in psychology class, but the ones where the little baby monkeys go and they either could have the mother that has some fur on it. It's a wire thing with fur, and then the other one's just wire. And the little monkeys that just have the wire, they die, they wither and die. The ones that have fur like a mother would be, they thrive. I mean, these are studies that really talk about how we are wired for attachment, whether we think we are or not. Even if we say, I just want hookups, we still underneath have a capacity and a desire for attachment. And I think that's where all the optimism is ultimately our humanness brings us all together. It's an even playing ground. Even if our histories or our culture or our peer groups are trying to tell us other narratives like, no, don't hook up, or do hook up, or don't fall in love, or you're going to be hurt. That's what I unpack all the time with people, no matter how old they are, is if they think they don't want to really become attached to one person, why not? What's the story? What are the narratives, conscious or unconscious, that really leads to someone saying, I never want to actually make a life with someone? Or even if it's make a life with more than one person, I want consensual non-monogamy done in an ethical way, or polyamory done in an ethical way. So it's not like we have to privilege monogamy, but to not have some space for wanting to love and be kind and take care of another and be taken care of, no matter what the sexual arrangement is. I would think there's some narratives to identify on why someone really believes they have no need for that. Because otherwise, it's almost like saying you're not part of the human race.
Wow, what an answer. I love that. That was gold. So you just touched on the narratives there.
Yeah.
So the first question I've got for you about narratives, which is this book you've coming out, I believe it's May 12th, my
May
memory.
18th,
May 18th.
still coming out. Who could believe it in the
Still
world
coming
it's
out.
happening? I'm so happy.
Amazing. So the first question I've got for you on this is, why is the belief that human sexual response requires desire as a prerequisite to sex a faulty belief?
Oh, well, now you're going to get me started, Bill. Make sure you stop me at some point. This is one of my most passionate topics. But you know what? It really is about the narratives of medical practice. To go back, we believe that when you read about, let's say, diagnoses of sorts, that's the truth. But if you really go back, and medical folks know this, medical philosophers and sociologists and historians know that medicine is a constructed kind of body of knowledge, just like anything else. Yes, there's a certain amount of science that proves X, Y, or Z in terms of a disease, let's say, and a cure or something. But when it comes to how do we operate, what's the proper kind of sexual response in this case, that was created by human beings who went into a lab. Masters and Johnson started us off in the 1960s, and they actually had real couples, imagine, Joe, go behind a one-way mirror and have sex, and they watched it and wrote notes, on how long it took people to have sex and what they did with sex. And they kind of launched the whole field of sexuality and human sexual response as a model or theory. It did not include desire at that time. What they started with was more what we call arousal, or getting excited physically, and then leading to orgasm. So the gift they gave us, and I'm using air quotes for people who hear this, is that sex always includes arousal and orgasm. Now that's problematic too, because that means that if someone has some trouble with arousal, like getting erections or getting wet or lubricated, or or they have trouble with orgasm, then under Masters and Johnson's idea of what sex is, you're already now broken or dysfunctional. Then in the 80s, there was Helen Singer Kaplan's work. That's when desire first was introduced into the medical and psychiatric psychological canon, into the sexual response cycle. So Helen's work was quite profound. She was a psychoanalyst and she was a sex therapist. So she was a really integrative pioneer, amazing person. And she, though, said, looking at Masters and Johnson's original human response cycle, there's something missing. And what she said was, you're missing a first stage, which is called desire. So that there it was in the 70s, 80s. Helen Singer Kaplan's concept was so compelling that it was included within the nomenclature in psychiatry and in medicine, in what we call our diagnostic manual, the DSM. So from that time on, desire was added as a requirement of what we call healthy sexual response. And you could know, like with anything else, Joe, once something gets put into a canon, into a form of knowledge, then people then start measuring themselves against it. And then people can be put into categories of either healthy or unhealthy, broken or unbroken. So you can almost say prior to the human response cycle, including desire as a first step, there were no desire disorders, because how could you have a disorder if the model doesn't have it in there as something you're supposed to have? So it's a very compelling part of history that that desire disorders were born after that desire was added to the human response cycle. So now it can be broken in three ways. Here's the news: either if you don't have desire, or if you don't get aroused, or if you don't have orgasm. And I always talk about with couples right in the beginning, the number one issue, by the way, that people come into sex therapy with, whether it's men or women, whether it's gay couples or heterosexual couples, the number one presenting problem are desire disorders, what we call people coming in saying, I have no desire, sexual desire, or you could have what's called discrepant desire, which some of your people who are saying unrequited love, this could be in that category where one person wants more than the other. So with desire, there could be that unevenness where one person feels more desire for sex and the other has little or no sexual desire. But when they come in right away, I say, well, we could try and get your desire back, or I could help you have sex without desire. The second option is much quicker. And actually what we could do is do both, but why don't we start with you starting to learn how to have sex without desire, and then see if desire comes along for the ride at some point. We can work on it. And people look at me like, are you kidding me? You can have sex without desire? I said, yes, you can. I'll tell you how.
So if I just try to just go back of what you just said there. So Masters and Johnson, they had this model in which desire would be a biologically driven function. Am I right in saying that? So if I came to you at that period and I said, look, my desires low, you would maybe suggest go on hormone therapy. Would that be something like that under that model?
When people come in, yes, even now, when people come in to a professional, a medical professional who still believes desire is necessary in order to have a good sex life, they often might say, why don't you take some testosterone, which is the kind of desire hormone? Or why don't we see maybe you're depressed, so we put you on an antidepressant. Of course, that could be very complicated because some antidepressants actually do affect desire in a negative way. So, but they could try to medically treat it. And that's if you believe it's a disorder. I don't believe not having desire is a disorder, so I wouldn't go with that route. I wouldn't say, if someone wanted a consult with a psychiatrist or an endocrinologist, I would certainly give them one. But I would say, well, I'd rather work narratively with you, if you don't mind, and see if we can have you start having really enjoyable sex without desire. And then, what's interesting, Joe, is sometimes when you don't focus on something so much that you feel is broken, sometimes it could then show up. It's almost reverse psychology, right? You want to make something happen so badly, you feel so badly that it's not happening, it actually guarantees it's not going to happen. So some people find their desire later once they're having good sex.
So why is telling each other intimate stories a good place to start?
Yeah, well, first, just to be able to be that intimate's a good start. For many people, what makes sex come alive is feeling connected. And they don't realize, some people say we're disconnected because we don't have sex. And I sometimes say, well, how do you know you're not having sex because you're not connected enough? I mean, who gets to decide what the order is of those things? So telling intimate stories, including the intimate stories truly of the negative narratives people were kind of burdened with, whether it was probably one of the most heartbreaking and challenging could be abuse stories, people who were abused as children, whether it was sexual abuse or physical abuse or emotional abuse, or it could be people who were neglected as children, didn't have the parents' real attention and love and cherishment that they deserved. And all of those don't have to come along with verbal narratives like, I wish you were never born, although I've heard those awful stories where people tell me that a father or mother actually said that to them. It could be just through behavior of the parent. If the parent doesn't make the child feel cherished and loved and with good attention, the child could internalize that as a narrative of, I'm not desirable. I really, I'm not worthy of love. So to be able to identify those and then share them with one's partner who really does want to hear them and be an ally in terms of empathy and understanding the journeys that each person had and what narratives they came out of childhood with is often a really solid foundation for then sexuality to be built upon. So that's a large part of my work is I will start often doing in-depth sexual histories and family histories with people before I give them any sexual homework assignments.
It's interesting. I wonder, could desire be broken down into maybe different components? Because I got two different sort of models in my head right now.
Uh-huh.
I've heard someone like Esther Perel say that desire is in the space between two people,
Yes.
whereas love is the thing that binds them.
Hmm.
And then I've got someone like my own mother that I've heard say that nothing excites her more than seeing my dad clean up or do the dishes.
It's a
So
great aphrodisiac, a
yeah.
husband who cleans up the dishes and puts the kids to bed too. Yeah. I often say that's what real foreplay is. It isn't kissing on the neck the right way. It's you tell your wife, go in there and you take a nice bath, read a book, I'll clean up, I'll put the kids to bed.
So
But then
does yeah.
you know how
Sorry.
that joke ends though, but then the husband comes in, the wife's already, she's feeling a little now interested in more desire. And then she says, okay, honey, let's do it. And he says, I'm too tired. That's the end of that joke. But go ahead.
So I suppose are there perhaps I'm not sure is desire contextual? Is it because I'm just trying to break those two different
Yeah.
examples down. How would you approach something like that?
And it's true that, with any kind of hypothesis people may have, and Perel has hers, and David Schnarch has his, and there are so many people, Stephen Mitchell, who is a great analyst, had his, and Esther talks a lot about his work. They all have various parts of desire that can be true on what makes someone feel more desire. For some people, let's say David Schnarch's work and Esther Perel's work and Stephen Mitchell, all of them actually are in the kind of area of you need to have a certain tolerance for differentiation, the very thing I talked about earlier, for there to be enough separation, enough mystery, enough privacy that then makes the person exciting to you. Like the not knowing, Stephen Mitchell would say it's the not knowing, the actual accepting of the not knowing of the other. I don't know that person so well that could make them desirable. So there's some very compelling arguments for our tolerance to not be just twins, like I said earlier, but to tolerate the difference can fuel desire. But what I would say with most psychological theories, it's good for some, but not everyone. For some people, what makes them feel the most desire and the desire to even have sex is being known as much as possible, to feel like there is a knownness, there's a familiarity, there's a comfort. So that I think the problem that happens in almost any field, right? nature versus nurture, closeness versus distance. Everybody has to get into their camp, right? So people then have all these arguments there. They could have these very, they could be fun arguments to watch. But what I found in all the years I've been in the trenches is that just one size doesn't fit all. For some people, they do need more differentiation in space that Perel or Mitchell might talk about, or Schnarch might talk about, and other people, they need more closeness, more love, more feeling empathy. Like, let's say, a Sue Johnson might talk about with emotionally focused therapy. She would focus more on the need for more safety, more connection that actually could feel. And you know what? Neither one's right or wrong. It's all, I say, let's just let them all exist as options, and let's uniquely see what works for this couple or these individuals. And maybe the biggest challenge could be when you might have two partners in a relationship where one really does feel they feel more desire for the partner when there is more differentiation, and you have the other one who feels more desire when there's a little bit more closeness and comfort. How do you find, again, the Venn diagram, the good enough? So it's not like either one is right or wrong, but it's how can you blend it? How could it be a win-win?
I remember I had one girlfriend who I remember I'd spent like basically an entire week straight with her. So we were together non-stop. And I remember this one time I was sitting on my sofa, and she was on the phone to I think maybe her mother or her father, and she was talking about evolution, and she was breaking down these concepts to her mother. I just overheard it, and I remember thinking, I was like, wow, that's attractive. And she
You
was
got
going through
hot.
these incredible details, and I was like, oh my God.
Yeah, so what turned you on about that, Joe? Say more.
Well, I think that I'm not sure. It's just maybe it's just like that. Wow, it's like this is an actual person, right? It's like it's like she's been attached at my hip for like a week, and then she's like reeling off all this information that I
Yeah,
don't know, and it's like, wow, she's like a
yeah.
person.
And she has a mind. You
Yes.
look at what the work you do. You love ideas. That's
Mm.
why you're doing what you do. So, the attraction of a woman who has ideas and who thinks and who can talk about them turned you on. When I
Yes.
first meet couples, one of the first questions I'll ask them, which is very common, a lot of couple therapists do this: how'd you meet, right? You always want to hear the how you met story. But one of the things I'll ask in the how you met stories, I'll say, when you saw him or her across the room the first time, what really attracted you to them? Go back then and try and tell me, put me in the movie with you, what really attracted you. And it's so interesting because sometimes I had one person say, well, I was in history class in college, and the teacher asked a question, and this voice came from the back of the room answering this question. I thought, who is that person? I want to know who that is. And that he didn't even see her, so he didn't know how she looked, he didn't know how she walked, he didn't know what her politics were, he didn't know anything else, but he did know that voice with that mind. So it's almost like how you describe it with your girlfriend on the couch, right?
Mm.
So for some people, then all these years later, they might come for a sex therapy and say, we want to have sexual chemistry. We want to have that, what's in the movies, right? You want to tear the clothes off and all that. I can't resist that body. And when you go to the what were you first attracted to? Sometimes it wasn't the person's body or looks. Sometimes it wasn't sexual chemistry. Sometimes it was intellect. Sometimes it was personality. I love the way he laughs. I love we talked for 10 hours. Sometimes it was political. They met at a boycott, and they were passionate about workers' rights, and they fell in love on the picket line, And I want to remind and normalize for people, not all of even though you may choose this romantic partner or marry them or whatever, doesn't mean it was based on sexuality. That's one of those cultural narratives, the Romeo and Juliet narrative. That isn't always how people attach or bond. And to
So I
normalize that's very important.
so I guess that I suppose self-awareness must be really critical when it comes to intimacy.
Totally, yeah. Yep. And to not feel that one's existence or awareness derives from the other. Like,
Mm.
one of the biggest challenges I think people have is really putting too much power in the other to define who they are. to help them feel either good in the world or not, smart or not, sexy or not, whatever it is. And almost in a Buddhist kind of way, I like to say, look, you need to turn the mirror back onto yourself. You're projecting or depending too much on the other. Turn it around and use whatever you're projecting or you think you're taking or dependent on the other for, and turn it around and look at yourself, because our partners are our teachers in that sense. Whatever makes us feel bad or good is really a part of ourselves. It's not really about them. So the responsibility ultimately is in our own relationship to ourselves.
Fascinating. That's fascinating. So we've talked a little bit about how we can potentially have sex without desire.
Yep.
So one of the things in which I'd love to touch on then is, I believe that there was one model in which you highlighted where orgasm was at the final end of the model of pleasure. Sorry,
Mhm.
at the final end of sex.
Right.
So does sex need to have an orgasm at the end for it to be pleasurable? No?
No, that's the
Thank
other.
God.
Thank you for
We've
asking.
all had them nights, right?
Yeah, we're going to attack those narratives, because you want to attack the narrative of you have to have desire to start, but also you want to like challenge the narrative of you have to have orgasm to say, gee, that was a successful night, because many later models don't have orgasm as the end point. It has it in there, but not at the end. So other models that are much more progressive and modern now, and that are based on very good research, have pleasure as an endpoint, for instance, not orgasm. There's a difference between orgasm and pleasure. Many people who I do histories with when I'm alone with them, Joe, would say if they haven't had orgasms, I'll ask them, does it bother you on a scale of 0 to 10, 10 being really bothersome, how bothersome is it? And they might say, you know what, it's close to a 0. So I'll say, well, then what's the problem? Well, my partner, actually, it matters. It makes him or her feel, what's wrong with me if I don't, quote, make him or her come, which is a very interesting languaging. Betty Dotson, the great mother of the orgasm in the United States, would say, we give ourselves our own orgasms, not our partners. It's our big sexual organ is the mind, and the connection of the mind to the body. And if you're orgasmic, that's because you're doing it inside yourself. You're using the partner, I mean, in a good way, to enhance it, but it's all about us. And but to have pleasure be an endpoint is so much more freeing. It's so much more expansive. And another endpoint can be connection. So some people will say to me, I had such a great sexual time last night with my partner. I'll say, oh, what happened? And they may tell me a whole story that doesn't have any orgasm in it, but they felt close. They loved the way he or she smelt or tasted or just touching all over, and all of the arousal that can happen even without orgasm, and feeling just cherished and desired and desiring. The desire could be there, but the orgasm wasn't. So everyone really, if you give them permission to go outside these very strict narrative of desire, arousal, orgasm, human beings has such a greater, more expansive capacity to enjoy sex. And that's why people stop having sex sometimes, is they're trying to shove their relationship or each partner into this very narrow definition that then means either you make it or you don't, either you're functional or you're not. And then all the shame and the humiliation and the fight and the feeling rejected all then just pile on.
Yeah, that's interesting. And it took me back to one experience I had when I was in university. And was dating this girl that I knew was more sexually experienced than I was.
Hmm.
And I met her, and she was appropriately dressed, should we say? And and by the time we got to bed, I'd in my head all day I'd been thinking about, you know, I mean, how am I going to perform, or you
Yeah,
know, this or that. That I was so mad that I just couldn't get an erection. I was so
there you
nervous.
go.
So I
Yeah.
started saying, oh, I just got a terrible headache, or I'm stressed, or
Um,
you know, I saw this terrible thing on the news, and it's this fault and it's that fault. And I remember she said to me, she was like, "Oh, that's okay. We can, you know, I just like spend time with you. We can just watch some Netflix."
ah,
And I
what a
sat,
gift that was.
I
Wow.
know, and I sat there and we cuddled, and I swear within about 2 minutes my genitalia had risen like Jesus on, on
That's,
his second coming.
that's
So,
right.
so was there an example of how we carry these own narratives in our head and then we're projecting them onto someone else?
That's right. And notice how you immediately, once you knew that you were going to be with her that night, your mind was telling your penis, you better show up, buddy.
Yeah.
And that good for that penis. In a way, I sometimes talk about, your penis is your friend when he says, too bad, I'm not doing it. Because, why should everything be rested on him? And that's a lot of pressure for that guy down there. So, sometimes and she was fabulous. See, she gave you an attachment answer because she was saying, you know what? I like you. I
Mm.
like you to sit with you and let's watch some Netflix because you're more than your penis. And that in a way, and your penis said, I like that message. I want to be with her, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. What a great story. There's a perfect example of how that was the arousal part, not having to have that arousal happen really allowed the arousal to happen.
Yeah, that's amazing. So I want to talk about these narratives that we're all, carrying around. I think that in therapy, I think you do boundary transgressions
Yeah.
as the first part.
Yeah.
So is the key to maybe even just getting out of our own head and becoming aware of these narratives that we're carrying with ourselves? Is the first step just awareness?
Yes, it is. That's the first. And that often happens actually in individual sessions with me, not in front of the partner, because I want the individual it could be 4 or 5 individual sessions with each partner. So you can imagine how long it could take over months if we alternate that with couple sessions. But it really allows a person, I ask them from your very first memory of sexuality. So the first question I ask people when I'm alone is I will say, well, as far back as you can remember, as far back as young as you could be, what's your first memory of sexuality? And so people might turn to me and say, what do you mean by sexuality? And of course, then I answer it like a typical psychologist and say, how do you define sexuality? And then it's so interesting, Joe, because people will start with all different stories. I mean, if I just wrote down every single story I got to answer that question, it is so broad what people start with. But that's their first memory, and then we unpack it. What does that memory say? How did your first experience of sexuality begin a narrative process? Because if your first memory was very pleasurable or good, let's say you were playing doctor with a kid in the neighborhood or something, it was just exciting and it was fun and nobody was shamed and nothing bad happened, and then you felt your first little inklings of arousal and being liked or just really having fun. Wow, that narrative, what's that narrative about? Your body can feel good. You can give or receive some pleasure or playfulness. Your body can be playfully, engaged in, no shame, no hurt, no coercion. What a gift, right? Or if on the other hand, someone says, oh, my first memory, oh, it was like 11 o'clock at night. My drunk father was coming up the stairs. I knew he wasn't going to turn toward his bedroom where my mom is. He turns toward my bedroom, et cetera, et cetera. And it's a story of their first experience of sexuality was something that someone had no control over. And that was a major boundary transgression with all of the shame and the hurt and the anger and the fear, all in their body and in their neurological system. To begin to then unpack that and understand the impact of that and all the narratives. The narratives coming from that could be, don't ever trust anyone. Don't ever surrender your body to anyone because they're going to hurt you. Sex is bad. Even pleasure could be bad because depending on when abuse happens, what state the body goes into of different kinds of experiences of arousal, but not pleasurable arousal, but just different things are happening. It can become very conflated with sex is bad, sex is hurtful, sex is guilt-inducing. There's a lot to unpack in a situation like that. But boundary transgressions can be all the way from that kind of experience to the boundary transgression of a parent telling a child, a little girl, let's say, who wears her first miniskirt and is feeling really, really excited. She's coming out of her bedroom to show her daddy or her mommy, and they look at her instead and say, you look like a tramp or a whore. Go back to your room, take that off. That's a major boundary transgression, an emotional one, a verbal one, and the narratives that can come out of that. Don't ever feel good about your body. Don't ever share it and have any kind of exuberance or excitement about feeling good in your body and looking good. And then years later, a woman could have then a desire disorder, quote unquote, no desire, no arousal, not wanting to have sex, not wanting to undress in front of her boyfriend or girlfriend. It really could have its effects.
Yeah, I find this so fascinating, and it seems to me like that I can imagine that pretty much nobody manages to get through unscathed, right? That we everybody's got something
You
which.
bet. Yep. Yeah. So that's very helpful too, Joe, and a helpful insight, because one major kind of truth about couple therapy, whether you're working with sexuality or non-sexual issues, is this idea that there is no identified patient in a couple. Meaning, now couples might come in feeling one person's the problem. So, and that's very common in sexual issues, where one person, let's say the person without the desire, with the lower desire, oh, he's the problem or she's the problem, or the man who can't get the erections every day, he's the problem. But really experienced couple therapists don't buy the identified patient idea. We see couples as systems, and people are co-maintaining a symptom, even if the symptom's located in one of the persons. Even if that person actually accepts the identified patient, says, yep, it's me, you don't buy it. Because as you're saying, there's always another story. The person, quote, without the problem, you go into their history, they did not leave that childhood unscathed in some way or another. Let's say they even were in a family system that was super duper great, right? Mom and dad were loving. Mom and dad had the best marriage, and they were in love, and they were a great model of people who loved each other, committed. They loved their children. It's almost like one of those stories from the 50s and 60s before you were born, those happy family story, TV shows. But, maybe the narrative to that is, I'm never going to be able to match my parents. I'm never going to be as good as them. I'm never going to be able to, be the father that my father was, or the husband my father was. You don't know what the narratives are. So, every single, and you could look at the same family history, one that had alcoholism or physical abuse, and those narratives can be very different depending. You never know how a child is internalizing it, what meanings are coming up. And many times folks don't know it themselves. That's why I spend so many sessions alone with them, to help them become curious about how did all of the events in their lives, they came out with some narratives of meaning about safety, about trust, about love, about sex. And they're good narratives too, by the way, Joe. So I don't want anyone or your listeners to get an idea that we're only talking about, oh, it's all terrible. No, some people come out with tremendous narratives of resilience, of love. Like, one of the questions I ask in a sexual history is, tell me the birds and the bees story. Like, how did you learn about sex? And did you learn about it at all from your family? Anybody in your family? And some people have remarkably great stories where parents were very comfortable with sex. They're very appropriately so. They had that nice balance of being very informative, very open about it, and educational, giving them books or having conversations, but they also wasn't too much. They knew not to flood the child. They knew they had the right boundaries and doing it for the right reasons. Boy, are they lucky. A lot of those folks come out feeling like, no, I always felt good about my body. My parents always made me feel good about my body. And they felt good about their bodies too. Because what another part where narratives could come in is not what parents do with us, but what they do with themselves. So some folks are carrying narratives of incompleteness or undesirability or body image issues of not being attractive, but it's really apparent. What they did was internalize their parents' feelings about themselves, not their own bodies, right? So that's why I also do intergenerational kind of history taking. I ask about, well, what do you know of your parents' history about their safety, their childhood experiences? Because some people can act as if they, let's say, they were sexually assaulted, and they weren't, but their mother was. And so they're carrying the mother's unresolved, unworked through issues of how they were abused in their childhood, and now this generation's carrying it. It's called the intergenerational transmission of trauma, technical term for it.
I love it. I love how I'm not just in bed with my partner, I'm in bed with, we're both in bed with all of our histories. So one of the things I'd love to
Oh, Joe, let me
focus.
just jump
Oh,
in there.
sure,
So
please.
you could say all sex is group sex. That always makes people laugh because you're in bed with everybody,
You're in bed with
consciously or
everybody.
unconsciously. Go ahead. Sorry to interrupt.
I love it. I love it. Where was I going? It's gone.
Oh,
I remember. Right. So,
good.
I was going to ask. So, in terms of these beliefs, I want to focus on perhaps how we can just bring some awareness to them, right? So, I remember many years ago, I read Nathaniel Branden's The 6 Pillars of Self-Esteem. And in the book, he gave this STEM exercise, which was just sentence, I am, and then it's just sentences going across. And for me at the time, I mean, that was revolutionary in terms of, really discovering my thoughts about myself, what I felt, what I believed. So I wonder, is there any exercise which you have for myself, for our audience, which we could do to just sort of bring some light to these beliefs in which we may consciously or unconsciously be carrying?
Yes, and they're related to what I would actually ask in a sexual history, family history. The first one I would say, if somebody wanted to begin to unpack just for themselves a little bit or explore what their narratives might be, start with the first question, sit down, paper and pencil the old-fashioned way, don't type it, use longhand, and just write down my first memory of sexuality. And then you sit and you meditate on that a little. And then write longhand. What's my first memory of sexuality? Who was there? What was I doing? And then really as if it's like a movie scene. Tell me the movie scene. So write down the movie scene. Then after that, ask yourself 3 questions. What was I thinking when I had that experience? What thoughts? And if I don't remember, let me hypothesize. If I had thoughts, what thoughts would I have had? What feelings did I have? Like sad, glad, excited, whatever. What emotions? And if I don't remember what emotions I had, hypothetically now looking at that memory, what emotions do I think I would have had? And then what sensations in my body did I have having that experience? And if I don't remember what the sensations were, which could be pleasure, it could be numbness, it could be pain, whatever it is, what would I have had? What do I think hypothetically? So that's the first big scene to start to unpack. Then as you look at those thoughts, those emotions, and those sensations, how would that experience affect me in my adulthood, my adult sexuality, my adult intimacy? Having had that experience with those thoughts, emotions, and sensations, how do I think that would affect my wanting to go on a date or start to know someone, share my deepest vulnerabilities with, share my body with? So those are sets of questions that I do in an actual session, or like a sexual history session, but that would be a big piece of writing and reflecting. And then after that, then I do a whole nother piece on what we call the parental couple. So they could have another piece of paper and say, my parental couple, if they had one. Some people have single parents, but if you had 2 parents who were a couple, then I often say, tell me about describe your parental couple as a couple. How much did they love each other? What's the story of how they met? And if there was one, and if they got it, and how much, do you think that your parental couple was in love? Do you think they were close? Do you think they liked each other, not just loved each other? How do you think they were? Oops, sorry about that. How do you think they were in terms of sex? Now, the funny thing is most people, we talk about in psychoanalysis, oh, the primal scene. We don't want the primal scene, right? Because to imagine your parents having sex, most people say, oh, ew, right? It's an ew experience. But, you don't have to get into the gory details of it. But to think about, some people, when they start to write about or talk about their parental couple sex life, some people say, except for my brother and I, or my sister and I don't think my parents ever had sex. Because they didn't seem like they enjoyed it. They never talked about it. I don't even think they really were sexual beings. So to unpack the the parental couple, because when you think about it, for most people, that's their first unconscious internalized role model of what a romantic couple is our parents, if you had a parental couple. So those are two big foundational things to start with. And then always bringing it to, well, having had a parental couple like that, how do I think that affects my life now? And for some people, it could be, I'm trying to do everything. There's a funny joke about parenting, even kids, when you have your own kids. I think about what my mother or father would do, and I do the opposite. So some people actually are trying to do romance or sex opposite to the way their parents were, because they felt their parents were so negative as role models. Other people are trying to be like their parents, but that could bring narratives or beliefs that I could never be an angel like my mother was, or the saint that my father was, or I'm not as handsome as my father is. I'll never get a beautiful woman like my mother is, whatever it is. So unpacking those two big areas are probably a really good place to start. Always tracking it to how might it affect me now, based on what narratives did those experiences might I be carrying.
Love it. I love it. The last concept I just want to touch on is when I was reading the article which you published, you talked about this idea of a sexual buffet and like a menu type
The
thing.
menu.
The menu.
I
So,
love the menu.
so when I was reading it, I could feel my heart start to beat faster and faster. I was like, oh, okay, this would be fun to do.
That
So,
would be really fun to do. That's
really
one of
fun.
those fun assignments to do, yeah.
So could you just touch on this concept, and then we'll just talk about where our audience can find you and the book and
Yeah.
your future work and stuff?
Sure. I come from Italian roots myself ethnically, so, food was just about the main, discussion and experience all through life. So, and it's not any kind of surprise to make a food sex kind of analogy. It's a common one. But what I like about it is it really is a playful way to get partners to think about, and people can do this as an individual too. You don't have to be coupled to do this, but it basically is a way of honoring what your appetites, so to speak, or consist of. Well, how would you define yourself as a sensual, sexual, erotic being? So when I give this assignment, that's sort of how I give the instructions. I say, I want you to sit down again with a pencil and a paper, not necessarily typing it on your iPhone, even though some younger people still come in with their menus on their phone. But I kind of love longhand. But make a list. It would be like free association that analysts talk about. Think about eroticism, sensuality, and sexuality, and just write everything that how you define yourself as an erotic, sensual, sexual being, the things you would like to do with a partner, the things that turn you on. And I always tell them, please don't judge yourself, don't censor yourself. So there's nothing that's too kinky, so to speak, too edgy, and there's nothing too vanilla or you think is too flowery. You just put it all down. And think about your 5 senses when you're writing. Think about what might turn you on or feel erotic or sensual in terms of what you see, or what you might hear, or what you smell, or what you taste, or what you feel on your body, so that people are really being fully sensual beings as they're making this menu. And also, like menu food analogies, when we go to eat, sometimes we don't want a hamburger every night. And that could be a problem with a sex life menu, is that one reason why sex could die out in a couple is that they're having a hamburger every night and they don't know it, or they're afraid to try the spaghetti instead of the hamburger, right? Or another reason why menus are important to be playful about is I'll say, you know what, one person might like Chinese food the best, the other might like Italian. You don't shame each other over that, right? Instead, what you do say is, okay, honey, tonight let's go Chinese, and then tomorrow night we'll go Italian. There's no shame about that. People shame each other in terms of their sexual preferences many times. They wouldn't shame each other about their food preferences. And then even once you get to the restaurant, one person may say, I'm not really hungry, so I think I'm going to have an appetizer. And the other one might say, I'm famished. I want a full course meal. And that would be fine too, right? Or ultimately, one person might say, you know what, I'm not hungry at all, honey, but I'll go to the restaurant with you and I'll keep you company while you enjoy your 6-course meal. So I like to give those examples of food how couples can deal with food. Because if you dealt with sex the way we deal with food in that way, we'd have a lot better times in bed, wouldn't we?
Absolutely. One of the quotes which I suppose speaking to you has really brought this into this idea. Sorry, speaking to you today sort of brought this quote which I read the other day into my mind, and it's a Proust quote, and he said, I believe, "The landscape of discovery is not seeking new horizons, but seeing with new eyes." And I
Oh, love it.
suppose that that could be applied to desire, to our partner. So I suppose that could sort of bring everything back together.
No, it's really beautiful because if I were to go back to like Stephen Mitchell, the analyst who I love so much, he gave an analogy in terms of passion and relationships to a kind of analogy of like, when you go on a beach and you're building a sandcastle on a shore. It's such an incredible experience to co-create that sandcastle, but knowing that then the tide's going to come in and it's going to take it down, right?
Mm.
But then the next day you come back with your pail and shovel and you're going to build another sandcastle, and it'll be a different sandcastle this time, but you're still creating this sandcastle in the sun and the air and the wind and enjoying all the sensuality of that, knowing that now the next wave will come in. It's almost like what the Buddhist monks do when they do the big mandalas of the sand. They sit and they do these mandalas for like, hours and hours. They build these beautiful mandalas and then they take it and they pour it into the ocean. And you go, oh my God, they did all those days of that mandala. Well, they're giving us the message that it's just like that quote. The joy in life is the doing, is in the being in the moment, not what you accomplish, not the eye on the horizon. It's the being present. And the more people are present with each other, that the body knows how to be with each other. We got to get, another line I often say to couples is your mind is not your friend when it comes to sex. And actually, I might even say your mind's not your friend, period. Usually our mind, if we're not feeling really good about ourselves, our mind isn't saying very good narratives to us. They're saying bad narratives to us. So often I'll say, if you could just be with each other as if your mind just really didn't have much to say, you're going to have a much better time in bed too.
That's so true, so true.
Yeah.
I always ask at the end of every
Yeah.
podcast, just maybe not, maybe relating to work, maybe not, but I always ask the person, based on your life, based on your experiences, if hypothetically you could broadcast a mass message to potentially every person on the planet, what would Suzanne's message be?
Oh, it'd be yourself and love yourself. And then you'll know how to love each other well.
Amazing. Suzanne, can you tell our audience about the upcoming book and where our Freedom Pack family can connect with you?
Oh, yes. It's called Transforming Sexual Narratives, a Relational Approach to Sex Therapy, published by Routledge Publishers. And you can go on to my website, SuzanneIasenza.com, and it has it there where you could order it through Amazon or through Routledge. It comes out May 18th, and hopefully it'll help the world. People love each other and have more sex and more fun sex. That's my hope.
I love it. Suzanne, this has been such a pleasure. The book and everything will be linked below. To whoever's listening now can just swipe up on the episode and there will be a link to Suzanne's book. Yeah, Suzanne, this was such a pleasure. And
Yes, it was. We demonstrated how pleasure can happen, right?
absolutely.